Hello. Thanks for that introduction. So a little bit of housekeeping notes. I am going to be sharing my screen. And while I do that, I cannot see the chat. So if you have questions, please either hold them to the end or provide some sort of verbal recognition that I'll be able to hear that you have a question.
Oh, I was supposed to say that. If people could put questions in chat, that would be great.
Excellent. Okay, so let's get started. I think that whoever is the host needs to allow me to share my screen.
Okay.
Down to the bottom.
Go down to where?
There should be an arrow next to screen share that gives you some options.
Cool. Okay. Is that going to work?
Thank you.
Excellent. It works. That way it'll give you something to look at other than just my face.
Oh, look at that.
Excellent. So today we are going to do a little bit of a legislative debrief from the 2021 legislative session. And I'm going to focus primarily on LGBTQ issues and specifically trans issues. In this presentation, I'm going to incorporate a little bit of background about what it means to be transgender, and talk about the different bills and how that affects community members and where they ended up within the legislative session, what bills passed, what are getting legally challenged in the court system, etc. So to begin, we'll start with some definitions and talk about the different impacts of policy. Very simply and quickly, this is the genderbread person. And I think that it's just a kind of simple graphic to get a little bit of information and explain the difference between gender identity, sexual orientation, gender expression, and biological sex. So very simply, gender identity is who you know yourself to be. For example, I know myself to be a man. Sexual orientation is who you're attracted to. So if you're attracted to men, if you're attracted to women, if you're attracted to the person and not necessarily the gender of the person, or if you're attracted to no one at all. And that can be broken into both romantic attraction and sexual attraction. And then there's biological sex. Now, oftentimes when we think about biological sex, we just think about someone's reproductive organs. However, the reality is that biological sex is made up of a bunch of very different components. So that's everything from internal and external reproductive organs to chromosomes, and even hormone differences. Now, oftentimes this is simplified down, but it's an incredibly complex system. And thousands of people are born every year with a condition that's called intersex. And an intersex person is someone who is born with reproductive organs, chromosomes, or hormone levels that aren't what we would typically consider strictly male or strictly female. Now, this is incredibly common. In fact, it's so common, it happens more frequently than someone being born with red hair or even cystic fibrosis. However, historically, we don't have a lot of stories being told or information being shared about what it means to be intersex. So it's a commonly confused condition. And then finally, there's gender expression. And gender expression is how you present yourself to the world. It can be everything from the way that you cut your hair to your glasses and your mannerisms, the clothes that you wear, and how you present yourself in general. So one other thing that isn't included in this slideshow but is important to talk about is sex assigned at birth. And that very simply is When an individual is born, frequently a doctor takes a quick look between the legs and says it's a boy or it's a girl, and that gets designated on their birth certificate. Now, it's not uncommon for people to find out later that they are intersex, and that designation may or may not be right. It's also very common for that designation to be inaccurate or different than a person's gender identity. So that brings us to the term transgender. And simply put, someone who is transgender is a person whose sex assigned at birth does not match their gender identity. Now, one thing that's important to note about the word transgender is that it is an adjective or it's a describing word. So it is correct to say a transgender person or trans people for short. It would be incorrect to say transgenders, transgendered, anything like that. I particularly like to use the language trans folks. However, some folks in the community recommend that if you're not a transgender person or an LGBTQ community member, you use the full word transgender. The flip side of that is cisgender. And simply put, a cisgender person is someone whose sex assigned at birth does match their gender identity. Another term that you may hear a lot is non-binary. And a non-binary person is someone whose gender identity is not strictly male or female. And this is becoming more and more common for people to share that they identify as someone who is non-binary. It's a term that, as it becomes more regularly known, more people understand that they identify with that term. So let's talk about the three impacts of policy. First and foremost, when we talk about legislation being passed or any type of policy being passed, if it's a new regulation that's coming from the federal government, from the administration, from the governor's office, if it's something that happens on the municipal level, or if it's a bill that gets passed through the legislature, there's different impacts of the policy. And one is the primary impact of the policy itself. So, for example, when we're talking about something like a trans athlete bill, then the primary impact of the policy itself would be the students who are no longer able to participate in sports with their peers. In addition to that, you have the social effects and misinformation of the policy and the process of the policy being passed. So this is all of the rhetoric, and it includes things like people thinking that transgender women have an advantage in sports, or different things like if a parent hears that there is a ban on trans youth being able to access healthcare, then parents are more frequently think that it's dangerous to be transgender and may not be as supportive to a young person who comes to them. Another impact of the policy itself includes things like increased rates of discrimination against the trans and LGBTQ community. And we have seen a significant increase in the number of reports of people experiencing discrimination since the start of the 21 legislative session. And then the final impact, the final type of impact is the impact on the well-being of affected community members. So this is everything from the stress of the policy itself to the misinformation to the internalized messages that people receive about policy like this even being proposed, let alone passed. And it can impact everything about how a person feels safe with their community. It can impact the amount of stress that a person experiences, and it can even impact things like suicide rates. In fact, there are a number of studies that have shown that even proposing anti-LGBTQ legislation increases the suicide rate among the LGBTQ community significantly. In addition to that, and actually I'll say on the flip side, one interesting study found that suicide rates among straight men and straight young men in school systems actually decreased with the existence of gay-straight alliances within those schools. So we know that the impact isn't just on the LGBTQ community. It can be on everyone's wellness, on whether or not people feel welcome and able to exist within their own communities. So in order to be able to address all of these policy impacts, we have to think about them kind of individually to be able to address them. This means that, when we're trying to address the primary impact of the policy itself, then we work to prevent the policy from going into effect. Or if it has gone into effect, we work to overturn the policy or minimize the impacts of that policy. When we're talking about, when we're talking about the social effects and misinformation and rhetoric of a policy, this means doing things like providing good and accurate information, providing training opportunities for folks. And it means things like working with the press and the community to be able to allow trans community members to tell their own stories and be able to make sure that the information being shared is good and accurate. And actually what we know in terms of countering misinformation is that allowing trans, non-binary, and two-spirit community members to be able to share our own stories allows for more accurate information sharing and is the best counter to all of these impacts of policies. And then in terms of minimizing the impact of the negative impact of the well-being of community members, it means things like building community, hosting decompression sessions for trans community members, having support groups, and making sure that there's a good turnout. There were a number of bills this legislative session that we knew an individual hearing wouldn't necessarily have an impact on whether or not the policy passed. However, we still did a lot of work to have a really big turnout for that hearing because we knew that young trans folks would be listening to those hearings. And we wanted to make sure that they knew that people across the state of Montana supported them and had their backs. So let's talk just a little bit about policy and political swings. It's important to know that after every major policy win for LGBTQ rights, there has been a massive pushback. And this happens politically, culturally, and both. One good example of this is that after the Supreme Court ruled that there would be federal marriage recognition for LGBTQ couples, the session immediately after that, there was across the country, there was an introduction of anti-trans bathroom bills. And what these bills would do is it would require people to use the bathroom based on their sex assigned at birth instead of their gender identity. So for example, I'm a transgender man, and a bill like this, if it were to pass, would require me to use the women's bathroom, which I don't think anyone would be comfortable with. We actually saw one of these bills in the state of Montana during the 2017 legislative session. And fortunately, we were able to prevent it from passing, and we were able to prevent it from even getting out of committee. But some notable wins have happened recently, which is a big piece of why there's such a national and in-state pushback and attack on LGBTQ community members. Some of those rulings worth noting is the Bostock decision. And basically what that court ruling stated was that Title IX and Title VII, which are the big articles that protect against discrimination based on sex, also include gender and sexual orientation. So what the Supreme Court found was that when we talk about discrimination, when we talk about sex discrimination, if someone is discriminated against because of their gender identity, that is a form of sex discrimination. So the picture here is a picture of Amy Steffens, and she was one of the plaintiffs in this Supreme Court case. And what happened with her is she informed her employers, she worked at a mortuary, that she would be transitioning and she would live her life as a woman. And as a part of that, she would start coming to work as her full self, as a woman. And her employer fired her. And so she brought this case all the way up to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court found that, yes, in fact, that because she was fired because she was trans, it was a violation of discrimination protections based on sex. So we had that big ruling at the federal level, and then we also had one of those rulings on the state level, and that is the Maloney case, which is a similar case but actually provided for broader enforcement protections. So because there was all these big federal wins and statewide wins, oftentimes what happens as a result is groups who work against LGBTQ rights take some other piece of the community or different issues that are often misunderstood, and they play on that misunderstanding and try and create wedges and try and, say that trans women aren't trans women, and so their participation in sports, they're just trying to participate to get an unfair advantage and that sort of thing. So the best way to counter that is to be able for us as trans people to say, this is who we are. And actually, we're just trying to live our lives and be members, active members of our communities, and be who we are. So let's talk about the legislative session. I'm sorry, was there a question?
No, I don't think so.
Great. So let's talk about the legislative session. This legislative session started with a couple really big differences. We talked about some of the federal and state wins on LGBTQ issues, but another big thing happened, and that was the change in the governor. So as I'm sure you're all aware, we went from a Democratic governor who was very supportive of LGBTQ issues to a Republican governor who has been known to fund groups that actively work against LGBTQ people. In addition to that, we lost some of our strongest advocates in the legislature. We lost 9 seats in the House and 1 seat in the Senate. So we were heading into a legislative session that was very different than legislative sessions that we've seen in the past. So let's talk about what bills were introduced and specifically what those bills look like. Many of you have probably heard about the trans sports ban. And what this is HB 112. And that ban specifically prohibits trans girls and trans women from being able to participate in sports with their peers. What the opposition or what the supporters of this bill say is that Transgender women have an unfair advantage in sports, and so they should not be able to participate with their peers. And what we actually know is that sports are incredibly powerful for young people to be able to participate in. It helps them gain a number of skills, including time management, as well as the benefits of being able to participate on a team. It creates strong relationships with other people, and that we found, not just with the LGBTQ community, but in general, people and young people specifically who participate in sports have less rates of depression, less rates of anxiety, and overall have less suicidal tendencies. In addition to that, they're able to participate more fully in their community and be appreciated for the skills that they bring. So what we know is that the claim that transgender women have an unfair advantage in sports is also wrong. There have been a number of studies that show that transgender women, after they have received medical care for approximately a year, have absolutely no advantage, and in some cases actually have a physical disadvantage to their peers while playing sports. So it's important to know that the arguments for this bill are all incorrect. In addition to that, we know that they say that there's a huge instance of transgender women and transgender girls in the state of Montana trying to participate in sports. Well, the reality of that is that it's not accurate at all. In fact, the reason that this bill is still in place after it passed is because we're having a hard time finding anyone to challenge it. Now, instead, what it does do is it does have two really big effects in the other ways of policy effects that we talked about. It has a really big impact on policy, it has a really big impact on rhetoric and how people that don't understand what it means to be trans perceive transgender people. It has had huge increased rates of discrimination. And we know that it has increased rates of suicide, anxiety, and depression in trans community members. So the next bill that we're going to talk about is the trans medical care ban. And basically what this bill in its initial form did was prevent transgender youth, so anyone who is under the age of 18, from being able to receive medical care that is associated to them being transgender. So this takes a number of different forms, but most commonly what we see is that transgender youth, when they have the support of mental health professionals, both of their parents and physicians who are familiar with and have a lot of experience with transgender youth, when they have the support of all of those and they are specifically interested in receiving medical care, oftentimes they go on what's called puberty blockers. And basically what that does is it just pushes the pause button and stops their puberty from progressing. And then after a certain amount of time, then they can either decide to go on hormone replacement therapy, in which case that would allow their puberty to proceed in a way that is in line with their gender identity, or they can choose to go off the hormone blockers, in which case puberty would proceed according to their own natural biology. Now, one thing that's really important to know is that there have been decades and decades of tests on these puberty blockers, and they are incredibly safe. It's also really important to know that it is incredibly difficult to be able to access these medically necessary this medically necessary care. In fact, it frequently takes parents who are very supportive and have time and are active to be able to find a doctor to be able to prescribe these prescriptions. It's not common. It is something that is very difficult to access. And so what this bill does is it further restricts that. And what it would mean is that any physician in the state of Montana that would prescribe this care or refer patients to someone out of state or in state would receive massive fines in the form, I believe the original bill had anywhere from $5,000 to $50,000, with penalties increasing with the number of occurrences. And not only that, but it would allow anyone, any interested party, to be able to file a suit against a physician up to 28 years later, which is really incredible. It's absolutely unheard of. Plus, it would increase physicians' liability so that even to be able to receive insurance would make it incredibly difficult. Now, fortunately for us, we were able to provide enough information to legislators that they understood and saw this bill for what it was, and they did not pass it. However, after this bill was introduced, after this bill died, another bill was introduced, and that was part 2. So HB 427 was reintroduced, or was introduced under a different number and a different name, and it targeted specifically surgical care. Now, what we know is that there is no physician in the state of Montana, or as far as we know in the country, that recommends any sort of surgical care unless it's medically necessary in terms of life and death for anyone who is under the age of 18 for lower surgery. So that's anything dealing with reproductive health care organs. When I talk about lower surgery, it doesn't include any sort of chest recontouring or any sort of mastectomies or different treatments like that. But lower surgery, no one in the country, and it's against medical standards to approve or provide medical care in that form. So not only is that bill unnecessary, but it still includes the issues for physicians that make it very, very difficult to be able to get insurance and provide care for anyone, especially for trans youth. And because we were able to work with such a great group of physicians and parents, we were also able to prevent this bill from being passed. Next is Senate Bill 215, and this bill is a little bit different because it's not just targeting trans youth, it is targeting all LGBTQ community members. And it has impacts outside of the LGBTQ community as well. So the technical name for Senate Bill 215 is a Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But we think that it is more accurately called a religious refusal bill, because the basis of this bill is that any person could break any law or rule or regulation in the state of Montana and say that they did it because the law infringes, on that person's religious freedom. And then the state of Montana or the municipality, etc., would have to come back and prove that there is a very good reason for that law to be in place and for them to enforce the law. So ultimately, what this bill would do is it overrides all the non-discrimination protections in the state of Montana. Someone, for example, I live in Helena. If I were to be fired from my job because I was trans, which fortunately for me, I don't have to worry about because I work for a very phenomenal organization. But if I were to be fired and told that it was because I was trans and I had proof of that, then my employer could come back and say, well, this goes against my religious freedom. And so because I have this religious freedom, I have the right to fire you, not because of anything related to your job performance, but because of who you are as a person. And we know that that's wrong, that people should be judged at work on the quality of their work and not who they are. In addition, it doesn't just affect the LGBTQ community, because it could allow people to challenge regulations based on race or national origin or marital status or any other protected category. So it's really, really dangerous. And we worked with a number of different legislators, and we're very, very close to passing an amendment on this that would lessen the impacts and would specifically say that people could not be discriminated against on any of the protected classes. And unfortunately for us, we were 2 votes short from passing that. So the bill did pass as originally proposed. And so we're working with other organizations to figure out how to minimize the impacts of this legislation. And ultimately, what we think will happen is when someone does experience discrimination and can prove it and are in a position where they can challenge the bill, then ultimately this will resort in some sort of a court battle to find out which has the greater weight. The thing that's really important to know about religious refusal bills is it creates the idea and sends the message of the false dichotomy of this battle between religion and the LGBTQ community. And the reality is that we know that there are a lot of religious organizations and religious folks who are very supportive of the LGBTQ community. And we know that there are a lot of LGBTQ community members that are very active in religious communities. And we also know that even when organizations and individuals aren't supportive of LGBTQ community members, there are very good ways that those groups can coexist amongst each other, and we can all support each other for who we are and the values that each other has. And so creating that false dichotomy really is a way to instigate this belief that that religion and the LGBTQ rights can't coexist, which is not true at all. So in addition to that, the last big bill that we saw was Senate Bill 280, and this is a birth certificate bill. And basically what it did was it requires transgender people to both have surgery and go to court and prove that they had surgery to be able to update the gender marker on their birth certificate. Now, for a little bit of context, there is no other place that you are required to have surgery or prove that you have surgery to be able to update identity documents. So for your passport, for your social security, for your state of Montana driver's license, for tribal ID, nothing else requires you to have surgery to have a gender marker that accurately identifies who you are. So for example, this bill is actually being challenged right now in court. And there is someone who lives in the state of Montana who is transgender and has identified as trans and has been living as her full self for over a decade. And this bill says that she can't get a birth certificate that says female on it until she goes and has surgery. Well, the reality is that a number of people do not have surgery because it's inaccessible, because of other medical factors, because of cost, because they can't get the time off of work, or because they don't feel like surgery is necessary for them to be who they are. And all of those are very valid reasons not to have surgery. However, having a birth certificate that doesn't match any of the rest of your identity documents can be extremely dangerous. It can out someone and let everyone know that they're transgender. It can prevent them from being able to obtain appropriate licensure. For example, anyone who gets a professional license in the state of Montana, whether it be a teacher, a physician, anyone, including even security guards, has to provide a birth certificate or some form of identification to be able to obtain that professional licensure. So then all of a sudden, in the process of attempting to obtain professional licensure, that person's identity as a trans person is all of a sudden out and public to anyone. And it can be extremely dangerous for people's health and for their well-being. Unfortunately, as I indicated before, this bill did pass, and it is currently being challenged in court. So let's talk about some of the other smaller bills. There is a bill called Senate Bill 99, which we refer to as a sex ed bill, that in its original state would change the opt-out requirement for public school sex ed into an opt-in requirement, meaning parents would have to be notified by the school. And the bill specifically included the language, anytime there was any talk about sex, sexual reproductive organs, gender identity, or sexual orientation, parents would have to be notified ahead of time, and then the parents would have to provide written permission for that student to be involved in that conversation. Well, that doesn't seem like too much of a big deal, but in reality, it is actually a very big deal, because think about if you're teaching some sort of literature with an author who is gay. Think about all the poets throughout history who are gay. Well, then all of a sudden, for every English class, do you have to have written permission from a parent to be able to provide that information? And in addition to that, we have anecdotal evidence that even just having the opt-in requirements prevent parents who would be supportive of their child receiving the information, would prevent them from being able to access the information because the kid forgets. I shouldn't say kid, because oftentimes when we're talking about sexual health and reproductive health, we're talking about things that happen at the high school level. But it would prevent, for example, how many times teenagers forget to give their parents some sort of permission slip. Well, then all of a sudden they're not able to access that information. So in addition to that, this sex ed bill would prevent any healthcare provider who provides abortion access from being able to be involved in any form of curriculum development or information sharing or teaching during the school year. So that means healthcare professionals who are well informed or who work at hospitals or different things like that couldn't be involved in the curriculum development process for any public school. So another bill that we saw was a right of conscience in education. And this bill basically is a RFRA for the schools. And it means that anyone within the public school system can opt out of teaching any part of the curriculum or any piece of their job that is in conflict with their religious beliefs or any piece of their conscience. So that means biology teachers wouldn't have to teach evolution. That also means that a school counselor could refuse to provide career counseling to a student whose parents who have parents in a lesbian relationship, anything like that. And obviously this would be very, very dangerous. In addition, we saw Senate Bill 179, which was generally called the Human Rights Law, but what this bill would do is it would remove anyone who is incarcerated, who is on parole, or who is anyone who's in the penal system, would remove them from human rights laws in the state of Montana. So someone who's out on parole and experiences discrimination because they're married or because they are an American Indian, all of a sudden will not have protections under the Montana Human Rights Act. Obviously very, very dangerous. And fortunately for us, we were able to work behind the scenes with enough legislators to be able to kill this bill or to prevent it from moving forward before it even had a hearing. Along the lines of the right of conscience and education was the parental health care bill. And what this bill, if passed, would have done is it would have required any healthcare provider to share information with the parents. So for example, if someone was seeing a medical professional, if you had a 16-year-old who was seeing a therapist for depression and anxiety, and they shared with that therapist that they identify as gay, that therapist would legally be required to share that information with the parents. Obviously very dangerous and potentially very devastating. And fortunately, again, for us, we were able to prevent this bill from passing. There was a medical ethics bill that required anyone in any form of healthcare to not provide medical care to anyone because of their religious beliefs or their ethics. So for example, if there was a car accident and a trans person was on the side of the road and the paramedics showed up and one of the paramedics discovered that this person was transgender, they could refuse medical care. Fortunately for us, this is another bill that we were able to prevent from passing. There was another parental rights bill that's similar to the parental health care bill, but more broad and included everything within the schools and gave sole authority over everything that happens with a child or a teenager to the parent. And it also included everything that was included in the parental health care bill. And then in addition, we saw the religious is essential bill. And ultimately, this bill was targeted at allowing churches to have just as much status and just as many rights and authority as public health care officials within their own churches. And then there was another bill that we thought could be related to LGBTQ issues, but ultimately was not. So, real quick, let's talk about where they're at right now. I mentioned that the sports ban passed, the RFRA passed, and the birth certificate bill passed, as well as some of these other smaller bills. We were able to kill almost all of the right of conscience, the parental health care, the medical ethics, and the parental rights bills. And then we were also able to kill the trans medical care ban. So that is a lot of information very fast. We are right at time, and I apologize for taking up so much time. But if you would like to stick around, I'm happy to open it up to questions.
I just have to say thank you very much for this amazing information. Really important, and thank you for your work. My goodness.
Yes, thank you. And the other thing that we didn't really have a lot of time to talk about was all of the wins that we did have. You know, and amongst the big 5 bills that we talked about, they were actually one of the most commented on bills in the entire state. So across all different subject areas, LGBTQ rights received some of the most comments. Over 6,000 people, there were over 6,000 comments on the bills. And then in addition to that, they were very, very heavily in our favor. So 68% of all comments made on the anti-LGBTQ bills were in opposition to the bills passing, so that they were in support of LGBTQ community members. So that's a great win for us. And I know several of you on this call were ones who made calls into the legislature. And I want you to know that we really appreciate that. And it really has a big impact, not just on whether or not the policy passes or not, but also how things are reported on it and how community members feel about everything that happened.
Thank you, Shawn. That was a great talk. I learned a lot. It was a great talk. And thank you for all you did. Someone has a question. Did you keep lists of all sponsors of these bills?
Yes. So interestingly and unsurprisingly, most of the bills were sponsored by 2 people who also sponsored the majority of anti-trans and anti-LGBTQ legislation in previous sessions. The anti-trans sports and healthcare bills were sponsored by, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank now. John Fuller, Representative John Fuller, up in the Flathead. And then the other big bills, the RFRA and Senate Bill 280, were sponsored by a senator. Who I can't believe I have to look up right now. I want to say it's Tom McGilvery, but I don't think that that's right. Carl Glim. Senator Carl Glim, who's also up in the Flathead, sponsored those bills. And he is also the same person that brought forward the anti-trans bathroom bill during the 2017 legislative session.
You did a great job.
Well, I would like to thank you. I read a lot, and this has been an issue that I've been tuned into for a long time. I worked in Chicago and had a number of trans students. And so I became aware of the issue long ago and have tried to keep up with the concerns of LGBT and trans people. And what I particularly appreciated with your talk today was talking about the biology, the doctors making gender decisions quite quickly in the hospital. And from my reading, I was sure that that had to be happening, but it was never laid out in anything that I read. And so I appreciate your bringing that to the context, because I think it really is an important part of the issue.
Absolutely. And I think one thing that's really interesting with that too is that when we're talking about the medical care ban and specifically the surgical care ban, a piece was carved out of that so that in instances where someone is intersex, they can still receive surgical care. But oftentimes what we see happening across this country and throughout history is that historically there have been surgeons that operated on intersex babies without parental consent or knowledge. And even times with parental consent and knowledge, the doctor came in and said, well, you know, you have an intersex child, but we recommend performing surgery right now, and then you raising this child as either male or female, depending on what surgical procedure the doctor decided would be easiest. And oftentimes that was wrong. And people didn't discover that they had this intersex condition or had surgery without their knowledge or permission until much, much later in life. You know, even into their 30s and 40s and upwards. And oftentimes when the doctors guessed if it was a boy or a girl or made a decision based on that, they were wrong.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Middlesex, that book was about that, I think.
Yes. Yep. It's a phenomenal read.
Yeah.
So, Shawn, I was interested in the three aspects of the impact of passing the legislation. And then the reverse is also true, I suppose, of like the recent Supreme Court decision on transgender bathrooms. Now, are you seeing some blowback on that in particular?
Yeah, so, you know, just as we see negative impact has those three negative impacts, we also see that positive legislation has those three positive impacts. So we know that after the Supreme Court legalized gay marriage, there was actually a drop in suicide rates in LGBTQ youth across the country. So we know that the reverse is also true. And we also know with things like conversion therapy. So if folks aren't familiar, there is a very harmful practice called conversion therapy where an individual goes through this process to change their sexual orientation or gender identity. And what we know is that it is not only ineffective, but it is extremely harmful for the individuals who go through this. So anyways, there's been a number of different conversations about how to prevent conversion therapy from happening. And one thing that is difficult is that oftentimes the people that practice conversion therapy don't have any sort of licensure, so it's hard to limit whether or not they can actually provide this practice. However, just the act of banning it and saying that it is illegal has allowed a number of individuals and has significantly decreased the people that participate in it and the providers that provide it, because it allows people to know just how dangerous it is. So that's another example of the different impacts of that. Well, thank you all so much.
Thank you.
You know,
That's wonderful.
we're very, very happy to serve as a resource. I'll share my email in the chat and want to make sure that that gets sent around. If you have any sort of questions, or if you'd like more training in the future about how to interact with trans folks, or, different things like how to help someone sign up, how to help someone register to vote if they are transgender, or share information about how to safely vote while trans. We're more than happy to serve in that capacity for you all. And we just really appreciate all of the work that you do and staying informed with what's going on in the community.